Excellent. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us in person and on the Zooms. I think we're all just making sure our technical stuff is all sorted out. Excellent. And we have a fantastic number of people who've come along in person. It's so lovely to see people in person. First of all, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and recognise their elders past, present and emerging. And thank you very much for Blockchain Australia. And in particular, I did want to call out Adriana for all her, not just her amazing efforts in organising this panel, which I'm sailing in on to moderate, but also just the amazing work that Adriana just does generally in the community, which we're all very grateful for. I don't know when you sleep.
I don't. I'm a robot.
And we will try and use this microphone a little bit because we're just being paranoid on our broadcast technology to make sure the sound will all be fine. Can everyone hear okay up the back of it? It's all working back there? Excellent. So this panel this afternoon, building a decentralized future. We're going to be discussing whether or not decentralization is a good thing, touch on some open source comments, economic incentives, a little run through some regulatory points, and maybe talk a little bit about some CBDC stuff as well. But first of all, I'm going to invite everyone to introduce themselves briefly. Again, we'll just use the microphone. So I'll start with Adriana. Well, thanks to you, but a little extra introduction if you would.
Thanks, Michael. Hi, everyone. I'm Adriana. I work with Prismatik. We build software. I'm also on the National Blockchain Roadmap Steering Committee and the Cybersecurity Working Group. I do podcasts, meetups. I'm all about community, and that's it. Here you go, Alexa.
Alexa.
Hi, I'm a regulatory lawyer in financial services working at Alderman, and I've been advising on blockchain and crypto related projects over the last 4 or so years.
Hi everyone, my name is Adrian. I'm a co-founder of Sigma Prime. At Sigma Prime, we do 2 main things. The first one is research and development for the Ethereum blockchain. The resulting work of that is an Ethereum 2 client written in Rust called Lighthouse. The second major part that we do is cybersecurity in the blockchain space. So we review other people building blockchains, look at their project, their code base, make sure everything's relatively secure, as well as projects that are built on top of blockchains like Ethereum, so smart contracts and this kind of thing.
Hi, I'm Pat from Mycelium, one of the co-founders, and what Mycelium does is we create financial smart contracts as well as work in the Oracle infrastructure space, so providing real-world data to a variety of different smart contracts such as synthetics on Ethereum.
Excellent. And I thought, just given the scope of decentralization is so broad, we'll be passing this back and forth a bit, I'll just be extra loud. Given the scope of how broad decentralization is, I thought I might invite Adrian just to give us a little scene setting of decentralizing in a digital asset or crypto context, just particularly for those who might be joining who didn't get to catch some of the, any of the basic ones of earlier in the week, but just at a very high level, try and limit it to a minute if we could, of how you see decentralized working in that crypto space, and particularly maybe against the example of, people think of the internet and websites as being pretty decentralized as a good analogy. But can you speak to that a little bit, thanks?
Yeah, sure. So as a high level overview, the internet is decentralized in the sense that we have lots of computers scattered around all over the place, but we typically use only a small subset of companies when we connect to the internet. So an example is your Facebook and Google, which are centralizing essentially personal data collection. In terms of finance, you use the internet to connect to your banks, but you're connecting to like a singular bank. So the idea is essentially the trust model. If the bank was corrupt or got hacked or is malicious in some way, they could change your balance and essentially your balance just gets modified because there's a single actor governing all of your things. In a decentralized system, the trust model, you don't really have these singular actors anymore. So you, instead of having a bank, you now have essentially a distributed set of computers. There's no one individually running your money, but they're following a singular set of rules. There's a clear example that I typically always use to describe the change in this trust model. One, I'm trying to keep this under a minute. So the example I usually use is in a traditional system, there was an idea of a lottery called a chicken lottery. And it has a simple set of rules. The rules are the participants agree with some initial set of money, say $10, and everyone puts $10 into this lottery. And if no one within a 24-hour period puts $10 into the lottery, the last person who did takes all the money. So as you can imagine, this thing slowly builds up and has lots of, like, eventually it comes to a point where in the traditional system, the person that's running the lottery, there's enough money in the lottery that kind of flips and makes them corrupt. They take all the money and the system breaks. But the set of rules are very simple to implement. You can put this onto the blockchain at the moment. When you do that, there's no singular party that can just come along and take all your money from this lottery. There's a set of rules that are transparent. You know what you're getting into before you start. And there's no single person that you have to trust that to come along and take all of your money. So this is an example of a set of rules that you can put onto essentially the blockchain or in a distributed way that everyone agrees on. No one can come along and change those rules on you. And the way that this is enforced is in a distributed manner. Essentially, it means in order for you to change those rules, you need to change a very large set of computers to do that, which is almost unfeasible. So the risk of somebody coming along and hacking or being corrupt and taking all your money no longer exists in a decentralized way. So this is kind of what's happening in DeFi. You have all these sets of rules or structures that are no longer run by a singular entity that can be corrupted or exploited.
Who gets the chicken?
In DeFi? I think there's a few examples on Ethereum where someone has
tokenized.
Yeah.
It's an NFT.
You can
An NFT of a chicken.
I think you can look up the transaction history and find who's won these kinds of lotteries. There's, as a security person in the blockchain, there's a few ways that you can actually cheat the system. We won't go into that.
Well, I was going to invite Patrick to just speak to, so I suppose in the DeFi context, it's probably easier to whittle it down, but what are the major blockchains that are operating in the DeFi space? And if you can just give a little note on their differences, if maybe 3.
Sure thing. So like Adrian, we're very involved in the Ethereum community in terms of sort of the community. There's a very rich community on Ethereum. All of them are creating incredible tooling for development as well, which sort of leads to these network effects in attracting more developers who build more development tools, who sort of are making this entire process of building this decentralized future a lot easier. So Ethereum for us is sort of the main platform that we're focused on, but you're seeing the likes of sort of Polkadot and Cardano starting to take off in terms of providing a few, I suppose, quite similar, but similar platforms, but they just don't have the network effects behind them at this point.
And are they so similar to be effectively almost interchangeable for people choosing to build on it? Or what would you point out as the biggest difference beyond just network effect of those 3 you mentioned?
I think the main point for us is probably around the piece of credible decentralization. Like there are many nodes on the Ethereum network, as Adrian knows, that are sort of contributing to this consensus mechanism. So in terms of sort of the standout for us, it's sort of around that level of credible decentralization. You can really guarantee that there's no sort of custodians that are coming into the equation and being able to reorder these blocks or sort of game the system in a sense. So that's why we enjoy Ethereum.
And Ethereum is very reliant upon an open source model. Maybe I could drop a question on Adriana. Why do we think open source models work so well in blockchain?
I think because in an open source environment, the scrutiny is decentralized, right? Well, if you're a developer, you want to contribute to any open source project, all you have to do is look at the code or look at what needs to be done and put your work to it.
I guess we still see hacks from time to time because we have complex code. So what do you see as the evolution of I suppose those risks being mitigated in an open source environment?
That's a difficult question for
You
me
can
to
swing it
answer.
to another panelist if you like.
Here we go, Adrian. I'm going
No,
to leave that
no.
to you because I'm not a developer.
That's all right. All right, let's get Adrian on it.
So I'll make 2 points. First one for open source is if you've got some system that's client that wants to take all your money, so a lot of DeFi, you can put a lot of money in and you can make some interest. If that was closed source, so as I was saying before with the chicken lottery rule, you can see the set of rules, so you know what you're getting into before you put your money into this thing. So you know that if within a 24-hour period, if no one puts any money in, you're going to make the money. But if the source was closed source, you don't get to see what those rules are. So you just, again, the trust model is you're trusting somebody who wrote that code to say, oh, I promise that the code that is here, which you can't see, does the things that I'm telling you to do. So your trust model, again, is still a singular person. So even if it's written on a decentralized system, if you can't see the code, it's still you're trusting the person who wrote the code. The second question was how do hacks still happen? Even if you have open source code, you can write bad open source code that it doesn't do what's intended to do. There's a whole area called formal verification, which is trying to get the code to do a set of specifications. But if you can't write the specifications of what the code's supposed to do, you can't do this formal verification process. So you'd be surprised how difficult it is to write good open source code or code in general.
It's probably, yeah, difficult to write code in general, but it's really, really good. But do you see that, it might even be a question for Patrick, do you see that challenge of the code quality, even though you're in open systems, as being something that's a strength or a weakness of blockchain?
Oh, it is certainly a strength. Like, there are so many eyes that are looking at this code, ideally if they're using it on an everyday basis, such that you can sort of achieve these small tweaks, whether that be in terms of optimizing the efficiency in terms of gas, so making the contracts a little bit cheaper to use, or just configuring a better way of sort of modeling the financial side of the contracts themselves. So with these communities that are forming around these financial smart contracts, you've got an entire group of people that are sort of, again, agreeing upon the rules of these contracts and tweaking them if they are inefficient. So with that, again, you're getting these really highly optimized, highly efficient financial transactions that you can trust. So certainly it's a strength.
And I might turn to incentives. A lot of these projects, like many businesses or products out there, like to incentivize users to do things. How do people who are developing these projects come up with incentive models that might encourage people to participate? And I can put that to Adriana if you want. It's not so much of a developer question.
Oh,
Thank you.
no, I think people like to be paid to do things, right? And in an open source community, especially, one of the ways that you can make sure that people are doing the work that needs to be done is by creating incentives.
Okay. And you've escaped questions so far, but when we're looking at incentives, there's shares that have an incentive by you get dividends and things, which are obviously a financial product. And then you have other things that might be incentivizing people to participate in a product which might not be. Can you speak a little bit to the difference?
Yeah, sure. So often a lot of incentives would be classified as rewards. So that might help you out if you potentially have a non-cash payment facility, in which case your rewards that provides you with an exemption there. Otherwise, it's also possible you might have a managed investment scheme or a facility through which someone will make a financial investment as well. So I guess it's always good to plug to myself and to us to seek legal advice around what you're doing to make sure you aren't unknowingly turning your incentives into a financial product.
Excellent. And I suppose while you've got the microphone, we've seen a lot of corporate adoption and institutional interest in blockchain come up, certainly in the last 4 months. I suppose I wanted to get your, and then perhaps Patrick's comment on, do you see that being sustained? Do you see it continuing? What's your view around that?
I think certainly blockchain is becoming much more mainstream, and I do see the trend towards greater adoption of blockchain. But obviously, you do need to consider, is blockchain the right solution for you, or are you just overcomplicating things, which sometimes does happen as well.
Humans overcomplicate things? Well, I never. Well, Patrick, do you think there's benefit to this institutional interest coming into the decentralized space, or is it a big fat cash grab?
Look, I think the institutional uptake of this technology is somewhat inevitable. We've got sort of in the next 10 to 20 years, I believe, all financial transactions will be conducted on whether it be an open source blockchain or whatever type of system it turns out to be. But these are much more efficient ways to transact. At the end of the day, it's a much cheaper way of achieving trust in the financial contracts that you're sort of utilizing on a day-to-day basis. So I think that it's quite young at the moment. It's obviously quite an exciting thing for some of the teams that are working in the space to see some of the larger financial institutions sort of posture in this direction. But we're still sort of a long way off of achieving this infrastructure that people can reliably trade on top of. So yeah, I think it's a good thing, but we're still sort of yet to see the actual wave of people using this technology in the best way that it can be utilized.
Okay, and that leads in very well to the next question. If I might ask each panelist to just comment, what do you think is something that could happen? Being lawyers, we think of regulatory stuff. What do you think is something that could happen from a regulatory side that might help encourage that adoption or certainty?
Yeah, it's a really hard one to think about and approach in my eyes. I'm not a regulator or a lawyer, but
what's something
I think something that's key for me in sort of understanding and us moving forwards would be how do jurisdictions think about these open DeFi protocols? What are you actually transacting with when you deposit your funds into a compound protocol? Who are the parties that are involved there? We just need some sort of certainty around that piece would be ideal. Whether it's just a slight comment before something sort of eventuates in terms of legislation or any regulatory guidance. But I think that's sort of where it's definitely going to be heading, will be these institutions or just retailers initially maybe utilizing these smart contracts, these open source smart contracts. So just some sort of certainty around what that looks like from a regulatory perspective would be great.
Adrian.
Sure. I'll come at this from a completely different perspective, from a security perspective, I guess. So from a security perspective, I don't really live in the regulatory world. I'm in the Wild West with all the blockchain stuff that's going on. But what we see is there's people who are developers, anonymous developers, and some of them have a mantra called testing in prod. And that's where they go off and they build a global financial system, which can hold multiple millions up to billions of dollars. They do this sometimes on a weekend or 2 weekends. And very rarely, they often come and try to reach out to us, or they don't reach out at all. And they say, hey, we need probably an hour for somebody to look over my 3,000 lines of code. And then I'm going to go and release it to the world. And people are going to put money into this thing. I'm like, well, that's not a reasonable amount of time to look over your code. So as you can imagine, what usually happens in these things, somebody releases some untested code or they test it in production. Multiple millions of dollars gets put into these things, and within a week or sometimes within a few days, all those millions of dollars get stolen. And then the people that put the money in go and talk to the developers, and they're like, why did you not get this tested? And the developers are like, well, why did you put millions of dollars into an untested piece of software? And then they find it on the internet, and nothing really eventuates. So from a regulatory perspective, I would imagine something probably should be done in that area where you shouldn't either be allowed to put money into something that is highly likely to be hacked, or you should be able to put things onto the internet that should be highly hacked. But both of those are kind of counter to the blockchain kind of ecosystem and censoring.
We might be pleased to know that the law somewhat already deals with that. If someone's putting out something representing it's going to do something, generally speaking, the courts will expect that thing to perform as represented. A lot of people, I think Alexa would probably agree, a lot of people think disclaimers do things they don't do at all, and that they're very protective. As long as it's a big disclaimer that no one reads, everything's going to be fine.
The number of hours that I've spent reviewing things that are potentially misleading and have to advise clients that maybe what they say they're doing isn't necessarily the state at which their business is or the product is developed at. I could count so many hours.
Billable hours, right?
Billable hours, but it's best that you know what you're doing, you know what you're actually doing. So you're probably the best person to describe what the actual thing is, rather than me coming back and spending all of my hours that you have to pay for, telling you, are you sure you're actually doing that? And
look, that's not something that's unique to blockchain or the crypto space, but it's definitely something that I think that, as Adrian pointed out, it's a particular challenge when things are moving very fast. So, and what's on your wish list of, I suppose, regulatory reform or change?
Well, so I have had a lot of clients, particularly wanting a wish list of what cryptocurrency or virtual asset and is a particular type of financial product. A great long wish list, which is always very difficult. But I guess another issue would be who is issuing the potential financial product in a decentralized platform, and getting some clarity, I guess, around that and the implications. But otherwise, a lot of my time has been spent trying to fit all these new products within the existing framework. So certainly, there's a number of holes, I guess, that need filling in that regard.
Well, no doubt, as many of us who are in the room or have been on Zoom, we had an excellent announcement this morning from the Senator Bragg and the Senate committee inquiry that's ongoing, saying there will be a policy framework coming out in the next, I think it'll be by October when the report is due. And so there's a lot of people who are going to be contributing towards that and hoping some of those holes might be able to be filled. Adriana, wish list.
I'm really glad you just mentioned this morning's event, because there was one thing that the senator said that it will be on my wish list, which is that the government cannot tell the banks what to do and who to transact with, which is fair enough. But on my wish list would be for the banks to stop closing accounts for people who want to transact with exchanges, because that has been a problem for many years now. And obviously, we don't want people putting their money in the untested platforms, but exchanges that have been Australian businesses employing Australian people and have been around for 7-8 years now, they're obviously not in that category. So that would be my one wish.
I would share that wish as well, Adriana.
Me too. But
Yes.
that's also not only a blockchain digital currency issue either.
And then that's a very real
Very
issue.
wide
I know it's been raised in the payments review as well. It's 20 years ago, a business could get away with cash, but all banks and payment companies now are effectively oligopolistic gatekeepers to the digital world, which is a challenge, because obviously from a political perspective, you are either side. You could say on the one side of the political coin, we should tell businesses what to do and ensure that people have services available to them. And on the other side of the coin, you could also say, well, people should be free to do with their money as they please, and that entities should be perhaps not putting arbitrary rules or at least providing reasons for those decisions that are being made. The comment from Senator Bragg this morning was, and being a Liberal Party senator is no surprise, that he doesn't want to tell business what to do or who they should do business with, but it is a very, very challenging problem. And as you say, not just for blockchain, but for other fintechs and other innovative businesses as well. It's a big challenge in our environment.
It's especially when we all get paid our salaries into bank accounts, and we have to transact from that single point.
Well, that's right. 20 years ago, you technically could still get cash in an envelope to be paid, but if that ever happens.
Rob, let's talk about that later.
But I'm not sure I know anyone who does that nowadays. And
anything above minimum wage or whatever form you like.
But just moving on to our next point, because and someone who might be less in favor of blockchain or cryptocurrencies would say, oh, but the banks are trying to protect people from scams. Scams are always a favorite of media. And you mentioned, Adrian, that point of people putting money into projects. Are there any tips that I might start with Alexa, that you might give to people who want to get involved, might not be as experienced in the space, around avoiding scams and staying safe?
Well, I guess the number one tip would be, if it's too good to be true, it probably is. But doing some due diligence, talking to some people who have been involved in the space, because they, I guess, have quite a good filter about what is really more realistic technologically wise, and looking at the regulatory regime as well, and seeing if it's regulated in a particular in your jurisdiction.
Adrian, how can people stay safe from scams, particularly in DeFi?
It's hard. Getting into cryptocurrency, there's lots of scams out there, and it's very difficult to tell ones apart. I'll stick with this my security theme, which is where I've currently been going with them. There's a general trend for projects in the space. If we're talking about building on top of Ethereum, you're writing, or even your own blockchains, to get security firms to have a look at your code and to make sure, or to at least check that there's no obvious mistakes kind of going wrong. There's no real, I guess, board or structure of the quality of any of the firms out there. So there's some people, we've seen some people that claim to be experts in understanding, let's say, blockchain security, but the reports that they produce have no understanding or very little understanding. So it's hard to tell whether a project that has been reviewed by somebody is actually a legitimate project and has been thoroughly reviewed correctly. So that's still something that probably needs to be worked on. There's also things that you should be wary about, specifically around projects that like to have like a little stamp of approval saying this thing has been audited and it is safe because it doesn't have any vulnerabilities because this company looked over the code. Having that kind of assurance is very sketchy, to say the least, and I'd be wary of projects that claim no bugs because there's typically always those kinds of bugs. So I guess the general thing, if you're looking at investing in a project, something that has been around for a long period of time and something that has already a lot of money in it, because that's where most of the hackers and people are going to try and attack first. And if it's been around and it still has money in it, then you're probably all right.
It's the biggest and baddest, and it's survived.
That's where I'm putting
That's how you view it.
Yeah, that's probably a pretty good general rule of thumb. I'd double down on the fact that these security audits are a good indicator that they're not always going to prevail, and there's better security auditing firms than others as well, with different sort of reputations behind them. So I think, if possible, try and isolate for reputation in these security auditors. But on top of that, it's usually a pretty good sign if there's reputable people within the community as well that are backing these projects. If you can't assess the code, it's usually a decent way of doing it is just getting a bit of a vibe check as to who's actually getting around the protocol or the project, and are they a reputable person? Have they been involved in scams in the past? It's decently a good indicator, but as we've experienced with DeFi, there's still a lot of insecurity in the industry and still very immature. So there'll likely be more and more standards that are sort of put in place to defend people against these things. But yeah, at the moment, I think reputation and security are probably the two key pieces for the layman getting into it.
And that is interesting because it is obviously, people get confused around trustless being used to describe blockchain systems. And when you're coming to assurance, the theme seems to be that there is a shifting of trust, at least around reputation. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that, organizations like Blockchain Australia have a role to play where they're going to be imposing some kind of code of conduct on members and ensuring that they meet them. There's several different ways, I suppose, to check reputation. Now, I thought we touched quickly on central bank digital currencies, just bearing in mind our time. Alexa, did you want to speak briefly to the major kinds of CBDCs we're seeing out there and how they tie into decentralization? And you can pass to Adriana if it's too broad, or answer the first part.
Do you want to answer it? So I guess there's a number of different jurisdictions who are currently involved in planning CBDCs, as well as including Australia. But I guess China's well on the way, in addition to like quite a number of other countries. I guess the one risk, or the one thing with CBDCs, which is different to a traditional digital currency, would be the privacy piece. Whereas I guess a lot of digital currencies have that, well, not digital currencies, virtual assets have that privacy protection. Do you want the government to be tracking all of your transactions when they're issuing you with their token? Yes, the other thing with the CBDC would be the government would be doing verification and be required to do the AML-CTF, comply with AML-CTF laws as well, which is another piece.
Excellent. Yeah, anything to CBDC or? Adrian or Patrick, do you wish to speak to that? I know we had some good panels on it earlier, and I don't want to tread on.
Don't want to tread on their
Tread on
toes.
toes.
I don't. I'll add something. I think when it comes to privacy, we are already giving our information away to whatever institutions we are dealing with, be it our banks or PayPal or credit cards. I think the only difference there is that if the government wants access to those transactions, they need to go through the legal channels. And with the CDBC, they could probably look into those transactions directly. Personally, I don't know how bad that would be if you're not playing in the illegal remit, but I don't know. Brazil has, I think, started exploring CDBC, and being a country where there's a lot of problems with corruption and governance, I think that would be a good place to look for as an example of how that could play out.
So you're saying almost we hand over our data anyway, but things get hacked eventually, and then that data can be leaked. But if you're in a more public system, at least you're aware of what's happening, and the pseudonymous nature of it gives some limited protection, unless and until one of those tracking companies associates a wallet to you and draws up a map. Because it seems that, I suppose I'll ask all the panelists, what do you think about the ongoing efforts to associate wallets with names and draw an almost map of how a decentralized world operates to identify people and have less anonymity in there from a privacy perspective? You've effectively answered on yours, but Adrian, even from a security perspective, are you comfortable with all your transactions becoming public one day?
I've helped build some of the systems that track things, so I know how you can de-anonymize wallets, especially in Bitcoin. Bitcoin has the way the wallets work, allows you to group transactions and people. We helped write a paper with Sydney Uni that was tracking illegal transactions in Bitcoin. I think it's called Sex, Drugs, and Bitcoin, if you're interested. But in terms of, am I worried about that? There's a kind of mathematics / crypto technology that's recently been developed, not specifically for Bitcoin, but it's being used in Bitcoin, called zero knowledge proofs. Zcash kind of uses it. It's being introduced in Ethereum. There's a thing called Tornado.cash, if you guys have heard of it, but it allows you to do some mathematical proofs that essentially you can anonymize your transactions. You can have transactions going in, transactions going out, and tracing between the two is mathematically impossible. So I think there is a trend in the blockchain space to move towards this privacy by default. So even though we can currently track or de-anonymize wallets and map them to some extent at the moment, it's because we're in the early stages. I feel like within the next couple of years, the whole ecosystem is going to be moving towards privacy by default. And then the systems that we use at the moment won't be viable.
And follow-on question,
Yeah.
could you reach out to Sydney Uni, maybe do an update to your paper? I've seen it cited a few times and the numbers seem a little old.
Yeah, I think the data set we used was 2016, 2017.
Which would weigh a little bit more towards
Yeah.
the drugs part of the sex, drugs, and Bitcoin.
Yeah, that was the point of it. Yeah, the point of it was we had external wallets for Silk Road when Silk Road got so from all of those wallets you could then try and map across users how the users were moving the money and this kind of things. There's a lot of statistical analysis. So shout out to the researchers that did that. I kind of helped them with the blockchain side. But if we ever get the time, we should update.
Wouldn't mind carving it out. We spent a bit of time sort of tackling that. That paper comes up from time to time and people think it's a bit more current than it is versus where things are sitting.
Yeah.
I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that. It's one of my personal bugbears of crime in digital currency. Chain Analysis does a great annual report that has the real levels of actual crypto crime that are very different to those earlier days.
Yeah,
do you agree? Is there
No, yeah, absolutely. The one of the lead authors constantly hassling me to update the data set. I haven't had the time, and
well, then on my list of things.
and like the data gets a lot bigger, so it's harder to process. You need big computers and these kinds of things, and I'm quite busy. Yeah.
Patrick, do you have any comments around the privacy and anonymity part of a decentralized world?
Yeah, I think the right for privacy is incredibly important, and we should always keep pushing down that path. It's just a matter of how jurisdiction friendly some of these privacy tools are going to be, and how people begin to regulate these things is sort of where you might see a few interesting things happen. But yeah, I'll double down. It is increasingly important that we are able to remain private with our transactions.
Excellent. And just before we move to take some questions from the room, if they have it, with Adriana's permission, she often asks a question at the end of
I'd like to
podcasts.
ask
Oh, no, sorry, you have a question to ask.
No, I'd like to ask
Oh, you'd like to
a
answer?
question, and you can answer as well.
Okay.
So I have a podcast called Blockchain Pro Podcast, and at the end of it, I often ask, how do you explain blockchain to those in your life that are not tech savvy? So I'm gonna ask that of mine first, and then of everybody else.
Well, I thought I was off the hook until I came on the podcast. Yes. Look, I deal with a lot of accountants, so I've always defaulted to the spreadsheet example because people tend to understand. And with the rise of Google spreadsheets, I often say, look, it's kind of like a Google spreadsheet that everybody has access to, but it's jammed on track changes forever. And people tend to be able to, I think, conceptualize that a little bit.
I actually have to admit that I don't ever really get asked in my personal life what blockchain is. So I don't have a good analogy to answer that question. I will have to come up with one. Sorry.
All right, you've got until the other two panelists end, and then we're coming back. You could take it as
Don't
a,
scare
explain it to your crazy uncle or someone who's not good with it.
Yeah, my mind change all the time depending on what people want to know. But in one word, I typically just say Skynet.
That's explaining
that's
smart
another
contracts.
Yeah, so in yes, from the Terminator movie, right? So you've got a piece of code that's distributed across all the computers, and they want to try and take it down. But in order to take it down, you have to blow up all the computers, which is very hard to do. So that's blockchain.
Yep, so I'd probably lead in with it's sort of a global computer or global database that we can trust effectively, and you can sort of see all of the transactions that have occurred previously, and you can see, and because you can see it and all these nodes have verified it, you can trust it, is where I'd lead in.
I like Patrick's example. It's nice and clean. I did actually some of my early presentations have a picture of Arnold Schwarzenegger at risk of copyright infringement, but then it scared so many people in the audience that they didn't understand that. Took it away. I went, it's not too Skynety. It doesn't actually control anything military, although the US are now using it for military supply chain. So we'll watch that space. Now, just turning to any questions we might have from the audience in the time we have remaining. We can even send the microphone down there. Questions for the panel?
One for Adrian. You sort of touched on some firms just kind of being used as like a tick of approval almost, and Pat sort of got into the reputation thing. A lot of the chat's been on regulation. How do you sort of see that playing out? Because I guess it's hard as an auditor. You don't want to be liable, but also you don't want, like currently anyone can just say, hey, I'm a smart contract auditor, come to me, pay me, I'll tick your contracts.
Yeah.
How are you thinking about that?
Yeah, so I think that there has been discussion of trying to set up a set of standards or processes and minimal things that you should at least check every time you review a contract. I think it's difficult to come up with, or it doesn't happen in the traditional world where you rate security firms based on a set of metrics. So I think doing something like that would be quite difficult to do. So I think it comes down to coming up with standards and processes of what each firm should do. In the traditional space, there's different kind of certificates you can get, different kinds of training for the individuals. So there's nothing really. There's a few different courses that's kind of scattered but not recognized in the crypto space where these kinds of things exist. But I think as the space matures, we might see a little bit more of that, more like traditional kind of cybersecurity level standards and processes being moved into the crypto space. But yeah, at the moment it's very Wild West, where some people for the tech audience, someone came along and in their report they found an XSS in a smart contract, which for the technical people it doesn't exist. So that was in their report. So there are some bad things out there.
So it's something you think will take a bit of time.
Yeah, I think it takes time, and then it needs to be recognized. There can't just be a group of 10 people saying, oh, this is now going to be the standard of cybersecurity in the blockchain space, and these 4 companies meet the standard, but everyone else doesn't. Then you will need everybody to kind of come together on what those standards and processes are. But I think, especially with the current state of things, everyone's kind of just building stuff, releasing it, and they're racing against each other to try and, you know, be the first to market, and not the security part of the entire blockchain space isn't a huge focus in my opinion at the moment, such that, you know, all the companies are going to spend time to sit down and go, okay, how are we going to standardize the security process before we launch these things?
That makes sense. And I suppose, as Kane mentioned in his interview, that, you know, the rise and the importance of people offering kinds of insurance or risk mitigation around that. A lot of audit insurance in TradFi is really, and to, you know, I've sometimes joked to people that lawyers are a form of very expensive insurance, because firms that provide audit insurance and even legal advice usually have big insurance policies sitting behind if they make a mistake, and someone can't go and insure their own project for obvious reasons, so they hire someone who follows a process which the insurer has then ticked off as, yes, we believe that meets an appropriate standard, and so if they make a mistake on it, then the policy might sit there in the background, which continues a journey, it seems, of step by step of interesting DeFi projects and things moving more towards traditional models of the world, or traditional functions of the finance world.
Yeah. So some projects have got built-in insurance kind of pools that kind of come with it for in case of hacks or bugs that they haven't accounted for. But estimating the risk is difficult for this kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a super difficult space. But it'll be interesting as well to see what could be adopted from the DeFi space or from blockchain space into traditional businesses that want to just take on those kinds of models to run things like insurance pools perhaps more effectively.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, we might have time for one last question.
1 minute.
Quick, to the back of the room. One last question. And while we're going down there, we will be putting on the 6 o'clock session on these screens in our boardroom for those who were planning on tuning in, which is a great lineup of panelists as well.
Just a general question for the panel. What do you think the implications are for tax enforcement and money laundering as things like Tornado Cash gain more traction and become more mainstream?
I don't know what
So a protocol like Tornado Cash at the moment, I believe you deposit in your funds into this sort of mixing protocol, and you've got your receipt, which is your zero knowledge proof to then sort of send the funds to the other side of the tornado, effectively cleaning them. So you're given that sort of that note, that receipt, and they're actually allowing you to generate these reports that you were the one that put your funds into the tornado pool. So you can verify that you weren't necessarily trying to evade the system, but you were just trying to achieve privacy or anonymity within the system. So there's sort of these mechanisms that you don't necessarily have to expose your identity, but you can still achieve privacy. But yeah, people that don't run that, then yeah, they're going to struggle.
Yeah, I think enforcing tax from crypto to crypto trades, and in the crypto space, if I trade Ethereum to Bitcoin, the ATO is going to have a very hard time tracking that down. But even if you use Tornado Cash, and let's say you have 10 Ether and you use Tornado Cash, you have 10 Ether out, the ATO is still going to track you when you convert it to Australian dollars via Australian exchanges. So it's at the point where you go into the Australian dollars part that's Tornado Cash isn't going to help you. Tumblers aren't going to help you. As soon as it comes into your bank account, then it's easy to track. And that's probably where the ATO is going to initially enforce. I think the difficulty is probably going to come when you start, for people that know MakerDAO or taking loans out. If you have a whole heap of Ethereum and you lock that up as collateral and you take out a loan and you put that into Australian dollars, trying to tell the ATO that you've taken a crypto loan, and then if that defaults and liquidates, at what point is the CGT then? How are you going to enforce that kind of stuff?
And the taxation is complicated, and it's a work in progress. There is, of course, a tension between things like AML, CTF.
Well, from an AML
yeah.
perspective, again, the onboarding from fiat, the Australian dollars to the coin is regulated, and the exchange would be doing that onboarding process and identifying and verifying.
Yes.
And to a degree, Australia's really lucky because we have a very open society, and our, if you really dig into it, tax returns rely pretty heavily at the large scale on honesty and people doing the right thing. So really, people do need to do the right thing so that government and regulators don't move to try and put in more draconian monitoring. People occasionally joke and be like, "Oh, I'm an OG and have Bitcoin from the early days. No one will ever see me." And and the tax office will have to prove that I've done something and need to pay, to which of course we say, you are familiar with the unexplained wealth laws, right? Where the onus switches for you to explain where you got the money for the Lambo, and if you don't, the ATO takes the Lambo. So when people get more across the problem of, okay, they might get away with some small scale shenanigans. They probably always would have got away with some small scale shenanigans, and it's always happened. When people got paid in cash, it probably happened. Way more than happens in the digital currency world. But as I always say, an immutable record of transactions is a really bad tool if you're trying to hide wrongdoing, because it's never going away. And once there's identification put against wallets, as a paper showed you to with City Idiots, there are wallets people did bad things on, didn't even bother to try and use available mixing tools back in the day on the Silk Road. Why? Because it was convenient to just send Bitcoin wallet to wallet instead of taking a few extra steps. And it's a matter of time before those people might get caught for serious crimes. And certainly as the value of things like Bitcoin shoot up, the incentive of regulators and particularly the ATO to say, hang on a minute, if people aren't trying to do the right thing, we're going to be coming in to set an example and make sure they know if they're being cheeky, there will be some serious consequences. So it is a tension, though. Privacy and the AML regime and where the data sits and what reporting happens is a real challenge to maintain that protection. And I think given the signal. So if you could, and thank you very much for those questions from the audience, and wanted to thank all of our panelists for giving so generously their time this evening, and those who came in real life. I believe we have some drinks afterwards. I'm so sorry for the people tuning in on Zoom. You can crack open a drink and say cheers.
If you haven't already.
If you haven't already, I hope you have at this time of day. But if you could please join me in thanking our panelists this evening.